Hello, this is Chuck Ridgway, Automation Technology Manager for Horner. Thank you for joining us for another Tuesday live stream. Now, today's topic is WebMI on the Micro OCS. WebMI is a feature that allows you to remotely monitor or control your application from a web browser, whether that web browser is running on a mobile device or on a computer. The Micro OCS is Horner's line of entry-level all-in-one controllers. Now, setting up WebMI can vary a little bit depending on which series of controllers you're using. Today, it's all about setting up WebMI with the Micro OCS. Okay, joining me today is Mr. Casey Gardner. How we doing today, Casey?
Hey, not bad. How's it going, Chuck?
Great. Now, WebMI is definitely a feature that a lot of users are looking to take advantage of. What are some of the goals that they're trying to achieve, as they use WebMI?
Yeah, some of the most common requests or features that customers I've spoken with are looking into are really if they're trying to remote monitor, they're wanting as much data as possible in kind of either the least amount of time or most amount of space kind of thing. So a lot of times they've got 20 plus screens or something on their OCS that they may be using, but they really only care about specific points of a lot of those different screens. So what WebMI kind of allows you to do is to create a custom screen based on what you're looking for and just have it more concisely fill that screen with various amounts of data that a lot easier and quicker access to those specific screens as opposed to just mirroring what the controller may have.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. So, why just replicate exactly what screens are on the OCS? Why not create custom web pages that look the way you want and work the way you want when you're working remotely from the machine? That sounds pretty good. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Now, today's program isn't live because of my travel schedule, so still ask your questions. We would encourage you to post those questions in the comments section. We'll get those answered, just not in real time, but as quickly as we can. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. All right, let's take a look at our material. We're going to start with a quick review of WebMI. What is WebMI? What are different applications for WebMI? We'll also talk about some of the differences between using WebMI inside and outside the facility, and it's mostly all about security, really. And then a bulk of our time is going to be spent talking about the workflow for adding WebMI to a Micro OCS project. It's not exactly the same as what you might do for an Excel series project, so we want to cover that in detail for you today. And of course, after reviewing that workflow, we're going to demonstrate it through a step-by-step demonstration. Okay, what is WebMI? Well, WebMI is the capability for Horner all-in-one controllers to serve up web pages over Ethernet from its local memory slot. Okay, the web pages are typically used for remote monitoring and control, one or the other or both. Now, the web pages that are viewable are created within Cscape. So there's nothing different about creating web pages from the standpoint of the graphics tools. You've got data objects, you've got bar graphs, you've got analog objects. All the objects that are available for you to put on an OCS screen are available for you to put on a web page. Now, the web pages that are created in Cscape are based on HTML5, and they're compatible with nearly all web browsers that are available on mobile devices, computers, etc. So regardless of what type of device you have, if it's a relatively modern browser that supports HTML5 based web pages, it's going to be compatible with WebMI. Let's talk about WebMI applications. First, let's talk about a factory type environment. So you might use WebMI inside of a factory to monitor machinery and equipment for operational purposes. Maybe you want to remotely start a piece of equipment. Maybe you want to remotely monitor what's happening on a piece of equipment, and that's done within the facility. Another case for using WebMI is maybe not all about remotely monitoring or controlling. It might be all about the data in the equipment itself. Okay, so maybe you've got a preventative maintenance program and you want to be able to remotely monitor a machine to check out when the last time a certain aspect of the machine was worked on. Maybe you're all about production efficiency and you want to know, you're a production control person and you want to know what today's production looks like. What are some of the OEE statistics for this piece of equipment? That could be what it's all about, the data. And then keep in mind that applications for WebMI aren't restricted to factories. They're restricted to really any control or monitoring type application like you might have in a campus environment. And I'm not necessarily talking about a college here, but think about agricultural sites or tank farms, okay, which are not traditional factories per se, but there's plenty of monitoring and control going on at that particular site. So that's another great application for WebMI. Just really countless applications available these days for remotely monitoring equipment. Now let's talk about using WebMI inside of a facility. So in this scenario, all the equipment that's going to be monitored, all the personnel that are going to be doing the monitoring, everything's inside the facility. So you've got a factory LAN, which is maintained by the IT department. You probably have Wi-Fi access points to provide wireless access to that LAN to certain devices and certain personnel. You've got a variety of computers that are sitting on that LAN, whether they're Windows-based or Mac-based or Linux-based, whatever the case may be. And you have personnel, some of which have cell phones that are authorized for use inside the facility, and tablets and those sorts of things. So that's a completely IT-managed factory LAN or IT-managed environment. And there's nothing special in that case that needs to be done to support WebMI. Now, there is an additional step within the workflow for setting up WebMI, and that is that in addition to having access to the factory LAN, whether that's wireless or wired, the personnel that are going to be using WebMI have to have access to the piece of equipment that's being monitored. So that means in WebMI setup, there's a username and password that's required to be set up for every member that's going to be accessing that piece of equipment. And it can be a whole slew or a whole number of sets of credentials for WebMI that can be created. All right, so inside a facility, the only extra step beyond, the normal security that's handled on an everyday basis by IT anyway, is the setup for username and passwords for WebMI access. Now let's talk about using WebMI outside of a facility. And these days, post-COVID, or as we're still kind of getting through COVID, this is becoming more and more common. More and more personnel are becoming authorized to access data from inside of a facility while they are outside their facility. This all became required during COVID. So let's take a look at the most typical environment that has nothing to do with WebMI, and that is, let's say you've got an IT-managed VPN. Okay, so certain personnel have VPN or virtual private network access to the facility from their home or wherever they happen to be outside the facility. And if they want to use WebMI and the VPN is in place, then they can use that VPN as a reliable means, secure means of that authorized personnel to access their micro OCS or other OCS controller over WebMI. And if they've logged into that VPN, then again, the only extra thing they need is the username and password for that piece of equipment that was created in WebMI itself. So that's one approach. Just use a VPN that may already be in place. Now there's another approach, and that is there are dedicated gateways, IoT gateways, that are designed to provide remote access to equipment from outside of a factory environment to inside of a factory environment. And these are from companies like Secamia or MB Connect, Ewan, Tazibox. These gateways are common and they're available and have been in use for many years now. Now, a third scenario is where you have a company which basically says, we're not going to allow any OEM to put a piece of equipment in our facility that they are going to be monitoring that is on our factory network. So anything that is going to be accessed from a third-party OEM for the purposes maybe of a maintenance program or something like that, or a service contract, they're going to require that that piece of equipment, if it's going to be accessed, cannot be accessed from the factory network. So in those scenarios, I've seen some instances where those companies have said, you can put a cell modem on your machine if you want to monitor it for the purposes of our maintenance contract, but that machine is not going to be on our network directly. So in that scenario, then you take that OEM then would acquire a cell modem or a cell router from a company like Multitech or Digi or 6net or Phoenix Contact, put that on the equipment itself, and then literally that piece of equipment has its own IP address that's accessible over the internet, and there's no way for that piece of equipment to interact with anything else in the factory, so that keeps the factory comfortable. So those are 3 different scenarios for accessing WebMI from outside the facility, using a VPN that may already be in place, using a dedicated IoT gateway from one of those companies I've got listed there on the screen, or go in the extreme case and just providing access for that machine only through a cell modem to the internet. Now we're going to dive into the workflow for taking a micro OCS that's running a project, running a machine, running a piece of equipment, whatever it's doing, and then adding WebMI to that. And the reason we're going through this workflow is because it's not exactly the same as the workflow that you might use for an XL series OCS, and it's really a good exercise illustrating how to accomplish this feature. Okay, so the first half of what's required in the workflow is really all about the project file. And really, anytime you've got an application with any of our controllers that's running a piece of equipment or a machine, of course, you've got to use Cscape to program the control capability and the monitoring capability that OCS is going to be accomplishing for the application. You need to program that and test it. So that's the first step, which is no different than you do in any scenario where you weren't using WebMI. So once you're done, you're going to take that file that's created and running on the controller, and you're going to duplicate it, and then you're going to rename it, and then you're going to work with that file when you're creating the WebMI type application. So it's starting from the original file, but you're not working directly with that original file. You copy it, duplicate it, rename it, you're good to go. Okay, now you open up that duplicate file and you go into the hardware configuration and you change the target from a X4 or an X7 or an X10, whatever the case may be. You change that target to Web Designer. Okay, Web Designer is a special classification in which you have the ability to design web pages for an OCS. And then when you select Web Designer, you also select the base resolution for your web pages. And there's 3 available ranging from 1920 by 1080 down to 1024 by 768. Now don't worry, regardless of which resolution you choose, you're going to be able to see these pages on a tablet or on a phone or on a full computer, and they'll scale up and down just fine at runtime. You just need to pick a base resolution for the pages that you're developing in Cscape. Okay, so that's the first half of it. Do your normal project, duplicate your file, rename that file, and then change the configuration to be a Web Designer configuration. Okay, the second half of it is all about developing the web pages, really. So now that you're working in Cscape with that new project that's been configured for a Web Designer, you're going to go into the graphics editor and it's going to be all about creating web pages. And the web pages could be more or less duplicates of what's already running on the piece of equipment, but keep in mind, you're going to have a lot higher resolution of your web pages than you necessarily do on the OCS that are serving up those web pages. So you might just scale those pages up to be bigger, or you might have multiple pages displayed on a single web page, just so that you don't have as much screen switching going around. There's a whole variety of things you can do. And you could delete all the screens in that new project and just start over and design web pages from scratch if that's what you want to do. Now, once you've got the web pages the way you want them, and again, it's no different than designing screens for an OCS. The process of adding graphics and adding data to the web pages is identical to creating an OCS screen. But once you've completed that process, now there's a couple more things. You need to create those username and password credentials for a variety of different personnel to be able to access the OCS using WebMI. Okay, so that's a step that needs to be taken. And then when you're done with that, now you need to acquire and deploy a license for this controller to run WebMI. Now, WebMI is not an included free feature, although it does have a limited function version available for free that's just, I think 5 data objects in 1 screen. But in general, the way most people use it, it's a one-time upgrade that is licensed, and there's no ongoing cost. It's just you acquire that license from Horner or from your local distributor, you deploy that license on the unit, and then forevermore, that unit has WebMI capability. Once you're done deploying that license, now you publish and test your web pages. And when we say publish the web pages, it's all about taking the web pages that Cscape has created, getting those onto the micro SD card that's going to be running on the unit. And that can be done by just manually copying the WebMI folder that Cscape creates, or it can be done over FTP from Cscape, where Cscape will download those files over Ethernet, for instance. Okay, so that's really the workflow, if you will, for applying WebMI on a micro OCS. Start with your original file, duplicate, rename it, change the configuration, go in and work on your web pages, add user credentials, make sure you're all licensed, and then publish and test. That's pretty much the workflow. All right, now let's go ahead and go to a live demonstration. Okay, let's demonstrate this workflow. So step one, we had to basically program an OCS to run an application, which is what I did. So if we take a look here, I've got a micro OCS that's running an epoxy machine. So it was about developing the application for that program and testing it out, making sure everything's working as it should, just as if you were programming a machine and WebMI was not even part of the equation. Okay, the next step would be to duplicate and rename the Cscape file running on the micro OCS, and then open that file and reconfigure it for Web Designer. Okay, well, let's take a look at that. All right, so here's my desktop. Here's my original file that I developed for the micro OCS, and then I renamed it after duplicating it. Gave it a slightly different name with WebMI in the description there, or in the file name. And let's take a look at this particular file. Okay, back to our slides for our workflow. Basically a reminder, we need to reconfigure the duplicate file for Web Designer and pick our base resolution. Okay, so back we go. We go to the hardware configuration. You can see it's currently configured for micro OCS and X4. We change the series to Web Designer. And now we have our choice of a variety of different resolutions, okay? And remember, it doesn't matter what your tablet or your computer's web browser, what that resolution is. This is just the resolution of the web pages you'll be developing. They'll scale up and down nicely on all your devices. Okay, so we reconfigured. I'm going to pick 1200 by 800 in this case. Let's take a look at the rest of our workflow now. So we go to the second part of our workflow, and that is we need to modify and create graphics that will be our web pages, and we're going to use the Cscape graphics editor to do that. Okay, so back to Cscape, to our project, go to the graphics editor. All right, now what do we see here? Now remember, this is a duplicate of the program that's running in the OCS in all things, including the graphics. And right now, as you can see, we started with an X4 that had relatively low resolution compared to the web page that we're designing here. So in my example project, I only had 2 screens. It was relatively simple. So I could either just delete these screens altogether and start over again in designing web pages to look the way I want. I could reuse these screens, maybe bringing multiple screens onto the same web page so that the navigation could be different. There's a whole lot of things I could do here in terms of the way I want my web pages to look. Now, what I'm going to go ahead and do here is I'm going to go ahead and open up a file where I've already done this graphics work, because it's not difficult work. It's just a matter of drawing the screens the way you want them. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a program which has already had the web pages rearranged and designed based on the way I wanted it to look and based on the functionality I wanted in my particular application. So what I did here was I basically, remember we have 2 screens running in my micro OCS. I went ahead and just copied both those screens to the same web page. All right, I got rid of my jump buttons because I no longer needed those because everything was going to be done on one web page. Now, whenever you create a web project with multiple web pages, you just use jump buttons to jump between the web pages, okay? In my case, I've only got 1 page here, so I don't need any jump buttons. So I've replicated the screens here so I can kind of remotely monitor and control the application if that's what I want to do. I've also set up some production data information and some preventative maintenance information here as well. Okay, so this is all pulling data out of this same micro OCS that's running the epoxy machine, but this data is really targeted for my production control folks, and this data is targeted for my preventive maintenance department. So let's go back to our workflow and take a look at what the next step is. All right, we've completed getting the web pages the way we want them. Next, we need to create user credentials and adjust any WebMI settings. Okay, well, let's go back to our project and take a look at how we do that. Okay, user credentials are all done under Config, User Security Configuration. Again, everything's being done from the graphics editor so far. I've created 4 username and password combinations, and I went ahead and hard coded them. Now, in an actual application, you're probably going to want to create variables here and then allow your variables to be editable on the fly for adding and changing any username and password combinations. But I've just created 4 different ones, okay? Production, maintenance, supervision, engineering, with very rudimentary password here, and then access level. So access level is, let me back up a little bit. So for every object you have on the screen that has an action to it, any object that can make something happen, whether it's changing a set point or starting or stopping something, anything that's editable, you can assign an access level to that individual object. That level can vary anywhere from 0 to 7. So if you've got an object on the screen that has an access level of 5, then only, in this case, only the maintenance, supervision, and engineering folks would be able to access that, because those credentials all have an access level of 5 or greater. The production person who has an access level of 3, when they log in, they're not going to have any luck in operating that particular object that has any access levels that are greater than 3. So that's what you can do to kind of adjust the access level. And if you've got a complete screen you want to hide from a particular, set of users, then just make sure that the jump object that jumps to that screen has a higher access level than what the lower level folks have available to them. Okay, so we've added username and password combinations here to give people the credentials they need, and we checked this WebMI support here, and then we've set or checked the timeout available. So this is the automatic timeout, I believe, for the user. If they don't do anything on the screen after 5 minutes, they're going to be logged out automatically by WebMI. Okay, all right, so that was the next step in our workflow. Let's go back and see what the next step in our workflow is. Okay, and that is, there was a couple things I forgot in part of that last step. There are some other WebMI settings we might want to adjust. So let's go back and take a look at that. So where else do we have any WebMI settings? Well, let's go under the screens and web options. And generally, I recommend these be left at the default, but the web page title, of course, would match whatever you want the title of the web page to be when you use your browser to use WebMI to access this machine. So by default, I think it says Horner APG. I've changed it to say Acme Manufacturing. Generally, you can leave the timeouts wherever you want them. If you are actually using something like a computer as a marquee where you're always displaying a web page continuously, then you might want to inhibit the session timeout so that doesn't happen. Okay, and then under advanced properties, there are some keep alive and publishing intervals and authentication types you might want to adjust. Generally, you can leave those at the default. For some of those kind of IoT access or IoT gateways we talked about from people like Tazibox or some of the other ones, you may want to change from digest authentication to basic authentication. I believe that's a step you need to take on the E1 device, for instance. So anyway, there's some other settings you may need to adjust, but in general, most of the time you can leave all those at default. Okay, so we've changed those. Going back to our workflow. All right, the next step is to acquire and deploy the permanent WebMI license for your micro OCS. Okay, so let's double check and see if we've licensed this particular unit. All right, and we can do that licensing directly from Cscape itself. So what I did here is I acquired a license from headquarters. I was sent a voucher, okay, which was a voucher number that came in the mail. This particular video isn't really all about licensing, so we're not going to cover it in huge detail, but you can go here under the WebMI menu in Service Pack 5 here, and under Display Validate WebMI License, the Seascape, if I'm connected to this particular OCS, it's going to go check and see if I have a license in this particular unit that at least meets or exceeds the number of pages, users, and data points that I have allocated here, or that I'm using here. So this unit's already fully licensed, okay? And if it wasn't, this would show up in red, and then I could hit the upgrade button, and then that would allow me to go ahead and plug in my voucher number and to hit a button and have the license acquired as well as deployed. And when we say deployed, basically what it means is it's putting a firmware.lic file on the memory card of your controller. If you're actively connected to the controller, it can do that right here from Seascape. If you're not, you would manually copy that file over to the memory card's root directory, the microSD root directory, and then move it over manually. But anyway, this unit is properly licensed, and so we're good to go there. All right, and then what's the next step in our workflow? Well, the very last step is just to publish and test our web pages. Okay, so what's that look like? Well, we go back to Seascape and we go back to our WebMI menu here, and then there's a couple things we can do. We can do publish website here, and this is the option where Seascape will effectively take all this screen development that we've done here and all these settings that I've just adjusted, and it will basically create web pages that reflect that. All the development I've done here. And it will take those files and it will attempt to send them using FTP, File Transfer Protocol, to the unit's microSD card. Now that requires that FTP is enabled for that particular OCS, right? It has to be enabled and you have to have access to it. Now in my case, what I did instead of using FTP is I went ahead and did a publish to removable media step at the bottom there. In that case, it created the web pages like it normally would, but it put them on the local computer, and then I manually copied those files over to the memory card, the microSD card, and then move the card over. So you can do it either way. You can do it over FTP using this publish website option, or you can do it manually by having it published to the local computer and just copying those files over. Okay, so that's what's required to effectively publish your website. Now we just need to test it, right? Okay, so let's go ahead and close Seascape here, and let's fire up our web browser and see how things look here from the web pages that I've designed. I'm going to go ahead and just use my local web browser here. I'll type in the IP address of the OCS, and boom, there you go. It's asking me for username and password. All right, I'm going to go ahead and type in, I believe, one of the usernames and passwords that I have configured into WebMI. I'll hit sign in. All right, now this is the very first time I've logged in to using that username and password to WebMI, so I'm getting this license agreement that I need to accept. There are ways to get that avoided, if you will. All right, so here's what my web pages look like. So as I mentioned before, I took those kind of two OCS screens that were running on the OCS machine, if you will, and I just put them both on the same web page. I put a title on the web page. I added production data and preventative maintenance information here. I now have the ability, based on my username and password credentials that I just logged in at here to my web browser, I have the ability to potentially make changes to things like, okay, if I want to change the next scheduled date for my nozzle maintenance, I could go ahead and change the date here. Okay, let's say it needs to happen it needs to happen on the 15th of the month instead of the 1st of the month. Okay, so I've made that change here. Okay, so this is the workflow, if you will, for applying WebMI to the micro OCS. So pretty straightforward, a little different than some of the options you have for the XL series, but still very, very straightforward. Okay, that wraps up our material for this week, and because we weren't able to record this program live or to present this material to you live, I won't bring in Casey Gardner for a live question and answer session here at the end. Instead, I will remind you that you can always ask questions using the comment section, and then non-real time, we'll get those answered in a timely fashion. Okay, another reminder, and that is we're here every Tuesday for another live session or technical session. And this month and for the past several weeks, we've been in the midst of a how-to series. We're just about complete with that. We have one more session left, and that session will be data parsing instructions in Cscape. Now, what are data parsing instructions? Well, very often in applications, maybe you'll have a conglomeration of data and you need to extract certain pieces of that data, maybe to separate it into separate data fields or whatever the case may be. Maybe your application involves barcode scanning or maybe J1939 mobile applications, and you need to, again, extract specific pieces of data from a bigger pool of data, if you will. We're going to show you all the instructions you can use in Cscape to make that go nice and smoothly. A final reminder, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And when you do subscribe, hit that bell so you'll get notifications whenever we go live, whenever we post a new video. Okay, look forward to presenting another video to you next week. So everybody, stay safe out there.